I'm Kathleen McNamara. I'm the director of the Mortara Center for International Studies. Today's program is actually being put on with the Mortara Center, the Dean of the School of Foreign Services Office, and Georgetown Women in International Affairs, or GWIA, as it is called. And we are extraordinarily fortunate, both today at this talk and more generally at Georgetown, to have with us Madeleine Albright. She's the Michael and Virginia Mortara Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy at the moment, but of course has had an extraordinary career that spans both the academy and public service, and now actually the world of business. Her PhD is from Columbia. Her BA is from Wellesley. She's had a long career actually at Georgetown, coming as a professor in the 1980s initially. She's also had a long career in public service, serving as the permanent representative of at the UN, and of course was the first female Secretary of State under President Clinton, followed then by several other, a truly path-breaking position. There she focused very much on the importance of democracy, on human rights, but also I think about your time in office as being so important in navigating the end of the Cold War and the movement of the United States towards a truly unusual, historically very unusual sort of unipolar moment. We also have with us today, we're very fortunate to have Dean Jennifer Windsor, who also has had a long and distinguished career in public service, most recently serving as the executive director at Freedom House, where she was for almost a decade. And now we're incredibly fortunate to have her here in the dean's office. From what I can tell, you sort of run everything. I'm not exactly sure if there's one particular thing, but she's, under Dean Carol Lancaster, has done an incredible job. Jennifer was educated at Harvard and then the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. We also are fortunate to have Rebecca Farmer with us, who's an MSFS student, co-president of the Georgetown Women in International Affairs, and who herself in her young career has also served in some interesting positions, including being at the Justice Department in the National Security Division and also at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. And so, again, we're very fortunate, I think, to have this panel. So what we're going to do today is the panelists have prepared a few questions for the Secretary to sort of start us off. And then we're going to do that for maybe about 40 minutes or so, and then turn to you, the audience, and solicit your questions and have a nice give and take. So my first question actually is to sort of set the stage in a very broad way. Obviously, the Arab Spring ushered in a remarkable unfolding of regime change in the Middle East. You know, it was truly an astonishing event for those of us who study international and comparative politics. I think, you know, the past year plus has truly been an extraordinary time. But I think we're all trying to understand still the implications of the Arab Spring for both stability in the region and for the U.S. interests in the world, and how we should sort of think about this incredible historical event in a broader sense, and how we might start making sense of it for international relations more broadly. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about the Arab Spring, just generally, to start?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. This is a great place, beautiful room in itself. I feel comfortable in saying this at Georgetown because this actually happened at Georgetown, but a couple of months ago there was a discussion with, that I had with Prince Turki of Saudi Arabia in front of alumni. And I said, well, I don't call it the Arab Spring because it's the winter, and so I think we need to call it the Arab Awakening. And he said, that's an insult because the Arabs haven't been asleep all this time. And I said, so what would you call it? And he said, I would call it Arab Troubles. And I said, what about calling it Arab Opportunities? So in those 4 sentences, I think you cover a great gamut of what has really gone on. I believe, whatever you call it, that, and I think Arab Awakening, for me, is the most appropriate. It is one of the major watershed events in history. I don't think things can ever go back to the way they were in any particular way. It is massive change and potential for even more change in an area of the world that has a very long history and is very important to the United States and to everybody. There are a lot of my expertise when I was an academic expert, as well as generally in government, was to study changes in the communist world. That was my thing. I wrote about that in my dissertation in various ways. I talked about change in the Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe, and so people would always say to me, well, how is this like the end of the Cold War? Very different. I think, except for just kind of change of situation in government, I do think that basically different in the following way, which is that those who were calling for change and were the so-called dissidents in Central and Eastern Europe and to some extent in the former Soviet Union wanted to identify themselves with the West. That was one of their major purposes. And to those that were in Europe, wanted to be in Europe. I was involved in a very interesting attitude survey in 1991 all through Europe and did focus groups and questionnaires, et cetera, all through Europe, but primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. And one of the answers to their questions was, we are Europeans, we want to be part of Europe. It is unclear what many of those in various parts of the Arab world want to be a part of, but certainly not just flat out part of the West. That is one of the basic differences. There are probably a lot of others, but I think that that is one. The other part that I think has to be said is that each of the revolutions or evolutions or whatever are somewhat different. Clearly there had been a lot of time where this was percolating, but it came to the fore in Tunisia when the young man immolated himself. I have spent a lot of time with somebody that many of you have read about or know, Hernando de Soto, who is a Peruvian economist who traces a lot of things back to people's property rights, their desire to have property in order to alleviate poverty ultimately by being able to prove that they own a piece of property and monetizing it and being part of their economic system. I have spent time with him recently, and he can explain a lot of what happened in the Arab awakening as an economic desire by people to be able to make a living. And the bottom line is the young man in Tunisia, what happened there was that his father had died. His mother did not have title to any of their property, and he was basically losing his way of life in terms of being able to get enough of the vegetables and things that he was selling in the market in Tunis, and so found himself in a position where he was separated from his way of making a living. Now, this could have been a great woman's story in terms of saying the fact that women couldn't inherit land is what this was about. The only problem is that he was then disrespected by a woman, lower level official, and that made him mad, so we can't turn it into that. But the bottom line is there were a number of immolations across North Africa and into the Arab world due primarily to lack of potential of people being able to make a living. In each of these countries, what's a little bit different is what infrastructure was there. So in Tunisia, there was some form of a government, and they were able, and some form of structure for people to operate in. There was nothing like that in Libya. There was nothing between Gaddafi and the people. So without going through all the countries, they each have a somewhat different footprint, and it's worth understanding what happened in each of the countries. There is an attempt in some of the monarchies to figure out how to not leave office and to be able to, and to try to get the monarchs to have reform. So that's true of King Mohammed in Morocco, to some extent King Abdullah, both King Abdullahs, one in Jordan and one in Saudi Arabia. But I think that they each are a bit different. I think the main problem out there, and we can probably talk about this a little bit more, one of the things that happens in the 21st century with the social media and demonstrations, it is one thing to demonstrate, it's another to govern. And the question is how you develop, how you get the people from the squares into governing. And this is where political parties come in. I believe in political parties. Civil society is very nice, but you can't govern with civil society. And so the creation of political parties, of channeling that energy that was in Tahrir Square or wherever into governance, is what the major problem is now. You cannot govern through social media. I call that kind of the Californiization of politics, where everything is done by referendum. You can't operate that way in a modern society.
Can I do a follow-up and ask you to speak a little bit more about sort of the U.S. angle and our particular interests?
Well, the U.S. angle, like everything else, is complicated. I think that you mentioned that when I was in office, there was this unipolar moment. And there really was. And what was interesting, I mean, I happen to believe, as I am always quoted as saying, that the U.S. is the indispensable nation. I fully believe that. And it was something, actually, President Clinton said it first, but I said it so often that it was identified with me. But we said it for a particular reason, and it's worth repeating now, actually, as President Obama did in the State of the Union message, taking full credit for it, is basically that it was a period after the Gulf War and after the Cold War, and there was really the sense that Americans wanted to turn inward and worry about what was happening domestically. And as an international relations person serving in a position at the United Nations, I felt very strongly that the U.S. needed to be involved, engaged internationally, that we had to play a role. And the reason that we both said indispensable was that basically it meant that if the U.S. were not engaged, nothing would happen. I sat at enough tables to know that that was true. But there is nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It just it doesn't say that you don't do things in conjunction with other countries. And the bottom line here is that I believed, and it was very clear in the 1990s, there was no other major power out there. The Soviet Union had disintegrated. But what was essential, and there's no other way to describe it than this, is the power of the United States was so great, you can't exert it all the time fully. It was like riding a wild horse and making sure that it was controlled within some kind of a multilateral setting. That moment passed, but I do think that the United States continues to be the indispensable nation and needs to play a role in various parts of the Arab awakening. The problem goes back to the first point, which is that they're not looking at us as the model. And so what is the role that we should fulfill? And in some cases, because of pragmatic reasons, we had a relationship with the leader that was ousted. So in Egypt, we are identified with Mubarak. And we're not so identified with Gaddafi, but they're basically, we were with Ben Ami in Tunisia. So I think so it's a little bit of a different role. I think that ours is a supporting role there.
Mm-hmm. And I think drawing out the comparison with the end of the Cold War in Central and Eastern Europe really helps sort of underline that. Your discussion about property rights reminded me that I neglected, of course, to mention that Secretary Albright is chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group these days and helping U.S. corporations with their global strategies. I very jealously think of her as being all at Georgetown all the time, but in fact, no. Jennifer, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you so much for coming here today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between international groups that help to support democracy and local groups that we know are on the forefront of change. And in particularly, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on the changes and the charges against both U.S. and Egyptian groups in Egypt. And what does that mean for the future of democracy and democratization experiment in Egypt, in your view?
Well, just to put it all into context a little bit, I definitely believe in democracy. I think it is the best form of government, and the United States is not a country that has the only democracy in the world. And so I also believe that we are all the same and that everybody in every country wants to be able to make decisions about his or her own life. It begins in terms of where you want to live and where you want to send your kids to school or what language they speak or whatever, but it moves up the ladder from doing municipal activities to wanting to have some say about the kind of government you have. I think that is a universal feeling. Just in terms of the democracy groups, I think that it's important to know how, well, you were at Freedom House, and I don't know the history of how that started, but I can tell you about the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. So just very briefly, what happened was in 1983, President Reagan spoke in London at Westminster and talked about the fact that democracies were not really good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. So he came back to the United States and started the Endowment for Democracy. And under it were 4 institutes, Democrats and Republicans, business and labor, kind of the warp and woof of society. I was the original vice chair of the National Democratic Institute, and we did not have a clue about what to do because our party system is different. We don't have institutes, and so we were trying to figure out, we saw, for instance, that the German political parties have something called Stiftungen, which are institutes associated with their parties, and they had been very actively involved in training in Portugal and Spain after Salazar and Franco in terms of helping them develop some kind of training programs and helping them through their elections. So we thought maybe we'd model ourselves more on what they were doing. What then happened was we would have discussions about what democracy was really about, believe it or not, and somebody would say elections, and we would say necessary but not sufficient, because as we can see wherever, including Russia at this very moment, you can have different percentages, whether they are free or not. We finally decided that one of the major components of democracy was the existence of an opposition party, that was absolutely necessary because it enabled there to be choice and accountability so that if you didn't like the people that were in office, you could throw them out and there would be somebody else there. The other part of the whole issue was that, and this evolved step by step, is you couldn't go into countries where they didn't want you. And so you had to have partners in the countries where you were. So the Republicans chose as their partners every party center-right, leaving for the Democrats as their partners parties whose names were the Revolutionary Overthrow Upheaval Party. And we decided we didn't want to do that we wanted to work across the board with all parties, and that we would be in countries where we did have somebody to work with. So that was a very important part of the starting of these institutions. And we did begin, our first thing that we did was actually in Chile, working with what was known as the No Campaign, which was already a coalition group to oust Pinochet. And really talked to them about how you form coalitions and how generally it's really the nuts and bolts of democracy, non-ideological, just the nuts and bolts of democracy. So we have been working since that time with major work in Latin America and also Caribbean and in Central and Eastern Europe. And had begun to work we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and had been in Egypt for some time. And trying to, it's not a simple issue. How do you work in a country where there is some kind of authoritarian system, and yet there are people that would like to learn how to be a part of their system? So it's a little antithetical as to why you would want to let this body upset you. In Egypt, they had a law about registering. We have tried to register, and they also had, according to this law, if you don't get an answer by 60 days, you are then registered. We never got an answer. And the interesting part is we have been in Egypt. We worked there under Mubarak and just kind of kept going and working. So one of the strengths, and I am very proud of NDI, I'm now chairman of the board, and we're in about 70 countries. what all of a sudden happened with the awakening in Egypt, we were there and were very solicited by various groups. They wanted help in a number of different ways of how to get from Tahrir Square into governance. Very busy, and one of the things that I pride ourselves on, NDI, is that we're not just Americans, that we have used people from other countries that we have worked with so that it's not just Americans telling people what to do, and we also work with local partners. So what happens all of a sudden in December, this is after all of the events, there is a seizure of our headquarters. And then all of a sudden, threats against the people and trial and a potential trial. I think many of you have read about this. What is now, and a travel ban. I mean, what happened was people didn't know there was a travel ban until they went to the airport to try to get out. And so what has since happened is the Americans have all gotten out, except for one man who didn't want to leave. The Egyptians are on trial. And some of our, the Americans had part of our team, we had a couple of Serbs, they were able to come out with us. But what has happened is this group that is basically not trying to undermine anything, but is trying to help in terms of their next election process, is all of a sudden under trial. And we don't know where it's going. What is interesting is that this is right hand, left hand, not knowing what's going on. We had actually been asked to be election observers during the parliamentary elections. So we were there doing legal work. In the meantime, they were raiding our offices. But it is an example, just to put it back into the larger context, which is that these societies, and Egypt is a perfect example of it, are going through major trauma in terms of who's in charge. And interestingly enough, the military SCAF was less interested in this than the Muslim Brotherhood. The head of the Muslim Brotherhood thought we were terrific. And because one of the things we're looking at is how to develop some kind of, the Muslim Brotherhood is not monolithic, and so trying to figure out how coalitions are built. But it's a very complicated story. There were several organizations that are under this kind of axe of trying to figure out. But it puts to question generally, and again it goes back to your original question, is there a way that Western democracies can be helpful in teaching about democracy and doing the nuts and bolts of democracy? I mean, even the Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey went to Cairo and talked about the fact about the importance of a secular Muslim democracy, and they didn't like that either. So it's a matter of, I think, that they are trying to sort out who they are, and the democratic institutes are just kind of victims at the moment. But it does raise the question of, can you operate in countries where you don't have permission to operate, which was the basic aspect of it.
That's right. It makes it very difficult to imagine exactly how to design effective U.S. policy. If I may, to sort of take up the further on the question of U.S. policy, of course, one of the biggest debates right now in the U.S. context is humanitarian intervention, a more sort of immediate and sort of forceful version of U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and obviously the question of Syria. So could you kind of comment on that and how we should think about the question of humanitarian intervention in that region?
Well, again, I have to say, I have many favorite subjects, but one of the things I do kind of try to learn from various things that I've done. And what happened was, when I was at the United Nations, there were a real evolution in the role of peacekeeping operations. And they, during most of the history of the UN, prior to the end of the Cold War, there were peacekeeping operations, but they were after there had been peace, and in fact tried to keep the parties separated so that they could live up to whatever their ceasefire agreements were or whatever agreement they had made. except for Biafra and a couple of other aspects in Congo. That is what they were until the 90s, when the UN got very involved in more peacemaking operations, and Bosnia was one of those examples. So there is, and then what happened, so that was kind of the beginning of, quote, humanitarian intervention, and there began also to be more of an emphasis on human security, that it was a matter of keeping people safe. One of the other aspects that comes into this is, one could say, I would definitely not be one of the people to say this, is that people didn't know what was going on during World War II in terms of inside countries and what was happening during the Holocaust. Nobody can say that about anything these days because we know everything that's going on everywhere. And so what happened was that a new concept arose called responsibility to protect. And it's based, it takes away the word humanitarian intervention, which sounds as though you are, in fact, intervening in the domestic affairs of another country, and puts it more onto the responsibility to protect. So it's not kind of Western intervention in some country. And what is interesting, it is based on the idea that it is the responsibility of the leader of a country to protect his or her people. That is why people get together in a country. And if the leader does not do that, then it is viewed as it's the responsibility of the international community to do something about it. And what is interesting, I am now co-chairing a task force under the auspices of the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Holocaust Museum and Brookings in terms of looking at what the concept of responsibility to protect means, because it bumps up directly against that holy of holies, national sovereignty. And because it does mean that if something is going on in your country and you're not doing anything about it, then the international community has not the right but the responsibility to go in there. So clearly what is happening in Syria is Assad is murdering his people. And what is interesting is that the Security Council resolution to do with Libya actually has responsibility to protect language in it. But we in our task force have been talking about whether that helped the concept or hurt it. Because in some ways there are those who felt it went too far. That what had happened was that there were some bombings, et cetera, that looked as though they were against Gaddafi's installations and not just the responsibility to protect his people that he had called cockroaches. So then there's question now as to how it applies to Syria. But it is an issue. I love the issue of responsibility to protect, but one of the aspects that I always point out is the following. I happen to be among the people, there's also responsibility to protect has extended beyond military aspects, and whether if there is some natural disaster and the president of a prime minister doesn't take care of that, does the international community have something, some responsibility there? So there was a question when there was a cyclone in Burma and they didn't allow foreign assistance to come in there. So take the following example, Hurricane Katrina. One could really say that the American leader, President Bush, did not do a good job in protecting the people there. There were people living under bridges and totally displaced, and floods and disease and all kinds of things. And one could say that they're not fulfilling the responsibility. How would we have felt if the Chinese had arrived all of a sudden and said, we're here to help you? So the concept of national sovereignty and this responsibility to protect are bumping up against each other, and that's what's happening in Syria.
Fascinating. Becky?
Sure. I'd like to shift the conversation to the impact that these changes are having on women in the region. Women have clearly been at the forefront of pushing for change in many of these countries, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and a host of other countries in the region. But at the same time, they've recently seen setbacks in terms of elected political participation, representation on constitutional committees, and other related issues. I'm wondering if you could tell us what impact you think these changes will have on women, and also what they can do to help secure their rights and their political participation in the future.
Again, it's a little bit different in each of the countries, but I think that in some countries there has been some movement forward. In Iraq, for instance, because there's some constitutional requirements that a certain number of women be elected to the parliament. Americans don't like quotas, but in some places there really are, in new constitutional aspects, a way of making sure that a certain number of women are there. And by the way, just to give a shout out to National Democratic Institute, we in fact have programs to train women to first of all get into politics, and then how they manage to work their way through it. So I think there are opportunities, there's no question, but a lot depends on the system that is being put into place. On the other hand, there also are, we've seen some dreadful things that have gone on in Egypt, the women that were beaten up in the square and ripped off their clothes and various aspects. There also are very serious issues, for instance, now in Afghanistan, where people, I happen to be for negotiating with the Taliban, but one of the things they're talking about is putting women back again into not being able to do anything or come out of their house or get any kind of education. So I think it is a mixed bag. I think that it's going to require constant pushing, but I'm going to say something that is very disappointing. The person that is the most corrupt and difficult and obnoxious and had everybody arrested in Egypt is a woman. And I think that she is somebody that was in the Mubarak government, and on the weekend, and on Saturday, she wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that is just a flat set of lies. Now the current president of Freedom House has rebutted it, but everything is a flat lie. She has been the person that has been in charge of all the foreign assistance money has gone through her in the past. And what she's objected to is that the money that has gone to these institutes, which has been funded by the United States government, has gone directly to the institutes, not through her. So she's been skimming, and she also, so I only raise this point is that not every woman is somebody that is the answer to every problem here. I do think that she's giving women a bad name in all of this, and one has to figure out, how to make sure that the right women that believe in human rights and in democracy get in there. But it will require a lot of work and will be different in each of these countries. And I think for the most part, in the long run, this is going to be good for women. But in the short run, there are some very serious backlash in terms of what is going on. But again, it's country by country, I think.
Great. Okay. Panelists, any other follow-ups, or should we go on to the questions? Okay, please raise your hand. There's a mic as well, and I think we'd like you to go ahead and maybe identify yourself when you ask your question. No questions, really? Yay. Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for your wonderful ideas. I'm Paula Ganga, second-year student in the Master of Russian East European
Yes, my student
Studies.
from last semester.
My question relates to the American withdrawal of troops from Iraq. How do you think that will play into the region? You just said that every country is different, but wouldn't that withdrawal have a broader impact throughout the region? Thank you.
Well, I think that one of the things to remember about the United States, indispensable or not, we are not an occupying country. We do not like to occupy. We don't want to be an occupying force. And I think that there has been a question generally about how many troops were in there. Should we have been in there in the first place? This was not a war that everybody agreed with. But partially, for any number of reasons, some political, some both political in Iraq and in the United States, it was time to end the war and withdraw the forces. What I think is unfortunate is that the agreements that were made in terms of bringing the forces out was that there was not enough of a way to have a real status of forces agreement and try to figure out how many of them would continue to be welcomed there. But the United States does not want to be there, and the Iraqis don't want us there. And therefore, I think that that is a very important part of the deal, especially since we don't want to be an occupying power. I think that generally the question is where and whether the U.S. forces should be anywhere in the whole region. And clearly we have a whole interest in the Middle East. And so there are all kinds of discussions about how much should be kind of at sea, whether there should be certain bases in countries, Bahrain, which is a genuine problem because Bahrain is one of the countries where not everything is going brilliantly in terms of the Arab awakening. And so this is very much of an iffy kind of situation. I think it was impossible to keep American forces in Iraq, the huge number of American forces there much longer. The question is whether there are ways that forces are defined, so we pulled out combat forces. So then are there other kinds, whatever the definitional aspect is, whether some of them could stay as advisors or different ways. And I think that that's something that is still being thought about and worked on. So.
Thank you. In the back?
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a student in the SFS, and I just had a question. You mentioned that the United States should take more of a supporting role relative to the Arab Spring and what it does. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate more specifically on what you mean by a supporting role. What specific actions should the government take, or what should it say about the Arab Spring?
Well, I think that the kinds of things that we need to be involved in is, again, it depends on the country, but let's take Egypt again, for example. The United States has had, as a result of the Camp David Accords, an agreement to provide a certain amount of military and economic assistance. And it is all linked together with also the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreements. So the question is, to what extent do we continue that assistance? I mean, I have to say what is completely fascinating at the moment, just to show you how confused the whole situation is. The American Congress had threatened during this whole thing with the institutes to decide not to give the military assistance. Why should we give military assistance if they are harassing our people and doing all that? And so there were those who said we should just cut it all off, and then others who said, well, let's be careful because we don't want the Egyptians renouncing the agreement with Israel. So in the last couple of days, there's been a complete reversal. The parliament in Egypt all of a sudden is saying they don't want American money. That will probably change again. But the bottom line is that I believe that even with less amounts in the Foreign Assistance Acts and in some of the military assistance, that we probably should be giving some kind of assistance in all these countries, probably conditioned in terms of some of the human rights activities and democracy. I mean, one of the things that's very difficult and was with Egypt is that in order for all this money to go, the Secretary of State has to certify that there's movement towards democracy in Egypt, which is hard to tell on any given day. So, but I think that we are not the only players. And so one of the examples, for instance, is cooperation with the European Union as is going on in the talks with Iran, or trying to get international support for sanctions against Syria, so that we are part of a partnership in all of this and not just any unilateral action by the United States. And in terms of what to do on the Iran nuclear proliferation, again, I think we're better off with multilateral action. So it's more a matter of that than doing what I believe was a very serious problem, which is the war in Iraq. And let me just say, it goes back to the democracy story. I spent more time on Iraq than most people because while I was ambassador at the United Nations, all we did was keep talking about the sanctions resolutions. And then when I was secretary, we spent an incredible amount of time on it. I personally was willing to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because the inspectors had been kicked out in 1998, and we didn't know what was going on there. But I also thought we had Saddam Hussein in a box. So I was opposed to the war in Iraq. And I was especially opposed to the fact that it militarized democracy, thereby making it very hard to do some of this democracy promotion and made it look like it had to be our way or the highway. And so in many ways, the whole issue of the war in Iraq has had an overlay that has had all kinds of implications for America's role in the Middle East. And I have to, it's no secret about my political views. So I had been at a, giving a speech, or actually on a panel in Missouri for an organization that was supporting the Truman Library. So I figured everybody in the audience was a Democrat. So I go through a similar discussion, and so all of a sudden this man gets up and he says, "So how long are you people going to blame the Bush administration for everything?" And I said, "Forever." Because I think that there are some very serious issues to do with democracy and America's role, and especially in the Middle East, that has an overhang.
I think those are really interesting comments, and sort of drawing together some of the threads of what you've said. You know, thinking about the difference between protect and intervene is obviously one way to sort of think about that. And you sort of nicely sidestepped my question about Syria in a way. But I think that, you know, the larger kind of theme that I'm hearing is, you know, thinking about diplomacy, thinking about the role of sanctions, and again, using the entire, I think, the toolbox of things that one has as a diplomat and as a statesperson, rather than moving to quickly use these sort of traditional realpolitik type tools. Okay, more questions? In the very back.
Hi, my name is Laura Capelin. I'm from Venezuela. And I wanted to know your opinion on what is the role the U.S. should play in the Latin American region, given the conditions that are threatening democracy in many of those countries.
One of the things that was interesting when I was secretary, I used to go around with a map that showed the movement of authoritarian regimes to democratic regimes in Latin America. And authoritarian were in red, and the democratic were in green. And by the time we left office, there was only one red island left. But basically what began to happen was some kind of a sense that democracy wasn't delivering everywhere. And Venezuela is an example that I use all the time. I went to Venezuela any number of times, and it was run by a bunch of tired old men who basically had no relationship to the people. They were elitist. And I can understand how Hugo Chavez got elected. He ran in some ways of kind of being more distributive in terms of the wealth of Venezuela. And it was very interesting. The first time he came and he met with President Clinton, I have to say we thought that he was charismatic and had a good plan in terms of taking the oil money and creating a poor people's fund and distributing it. He then obviously started acting in authoritarian ways again, and there was and I feel sorry for the people of Venezuela, but what I mean out of all of this is, and I learned this in terms of the democracy work. In all your classes, I am sure that there are these long discussions about what comes first, political development or economic development. The bottom line is they go together. So it's important, and I put it this way, and it's proven in Latin America. People want to vote and eat. And so democracy has to deliver. there have to be economic changes that go with democratic governments, and a way that you don't exclude the indigenous peoples, or you don't, there has to be a way that the wealth is in some way shared so that everybody is a beneficiary. And so for me, the whole question in Latin America is how the economies are also developed along with the political changes that are going on. And it's a rather broad answer, but it is political and economic development together.
Good. I had a bunch of hands. Yes, right here in the striped coat.
My name's Gabriel.
I don't know how.
I'm a sophomore in the SFS. So I'm wondering, we've kind of danced around what the U.S. interest in the Middle East is, and I believe for a long time, since Carter, it's been oil. So I'd like to hear your comments on how oil has played into the Arab Spring, particularly talking about the wealth of the particularly wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and why, whether it's been more even heavier support of the United States in those countries, or their wealth, and how they've distributed money and services to their people, because we still see many monarchies and authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So I'd like to hear what you think, how oil plays into it in terms of U.S. interests and in terms of economic development.
So I have to tell you, in my more kind of idealistic view of the world, I have hated to think that it's all about oil. I find that repulsive, I have to tell you. On my more realistic days, I kind of think, okay, some of it has an awful lot to do with oil. What I think is interesting is to kind of look at the history of the Middle East. President Clinton told me to read one particular book, so I obviously read it. It's called The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, that talks about how the history of the modern Middle East. And it's very interesting because so many of the aspects, and it's post-World War I, go back to that. And the short version of the book is that the modern Middle East was created by the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other. And a lot of the lines that are there in terms of the countries come from that period. And what really did happen was, as the British pulled out of the Middle East, all of a sudden, as a result of their declining power, the United States became kind of the responsible power in the Middle East for any number of different things. And I think not necessarily to do with oil, but more in terms of what was going on in terms of changes in the Middle East. And I think that to a great extent that still is part of what goes on. Not all the countries have oil, but clearly the Middle East, in addition to oil, is sits on top of a lot of transit routes, is a center of trade, any number of different aspects. I think the hardest part, and this is a very hard part to tell idealistic students, but the hard part about when you actually do policy is you often have to deal with leaders and countries that you don't like, that for some reason are helpful in your national interest. And so you find yourself with some leaders that you might not necessarily agree with everything that they do. That has been true of some of the monarchies. And I think that, and Saudi Arabia in some ways fits into both. They obviously a lot of oil, but also in terms of a fairly directing kind of monarchy. But Jordan is not into oil, and Syria is we were involved with for any number of other reasons in terms of its location. So I think some of it has to do with oil, but some of it has to do with kind of responsibility, or shared, what I would argue for now is shared responsibility for a part of the world that is crucial in terms of geostrategic issues. The Middle East was very important to the United States during the Cold War. and an area of competition with the Soviet Union. Some of those things hang on. I mean, Russia's interest in what is going on in Syria and Iran has to do with the relationships that they developed at that particular time. So I do think oil plays a part. I do think that it is a reason that we need some kind of an energy policy so that we're not dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but it will not, even if we were to get an independent energy policy, I think we still would have certain responsibilities in the Middle East, and we still would find ourselves probably dealing at various times with certain people for kind of national interest reasons that we might not think are the world's greatest democrats.
Okay. Yes. Right here.
Hi, I'm Riley Dowd, a senior in the SFS. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the role of media and specifically Western journalists covering the Arab uprisings and how, or awakening, and how, I mean, I remember a year ago we were seeing, protesters in Tahrir Square being sprayed out of canisters that read "Made in the USA." So do you think that those kinds of images which were brought and broadcast around the world, do they do a disservice to the United States government?
Another one of my students. Let me just say this, is that I am a great believer in the freedom of the press and the media really exposing what is going on anywhere. And the bottom line in terms of change, whether it's in the Central and Eastern Europe or the Arab world, a lot depends on people being exposed to what is going on. There's several kinds of media these days, though. There's the social media, which obviously played a huge role in what was going on, and connecting people that had not been connected. It was, called a Google revolution and a variety of different things. I am, however, quite critical of the way that the media covered, especially what was going on in Egypt, for the following reason, which is that it was covered as if it were a spectator sport, not even one that had overtime. Basically, that everything had to be done, it was going along, and Anderson Cooper thought he was a rebel or something. And so there was this kind of sense that it was going to go on, it was fabulous, and everybody was going to live happily ever after, and it would be over. And so they didn't do a favor either to the people that they were covering or to those of us that were observing it. And so, and if one's going to use sports analogies, then it's a marathon. This is a very long story. And by making it seem as if it was a basketball game or something, I think it created a certain expectation that could not be met. It was very exciting to watch, but so there's that part that I didn't like. What I do now, for instance, you were talking about Syria, there are pictures in the last few days that in fact are showing the horrors of what's happening in Syria. That brings into direct line what I was talking about, the responsibility to protect. If there had been pictures like that of Auschwitz at the time, maybe more would have been done. Who knows? It's a little hard to deny that terrible things are going on when you have cameras inside. So it's a mixed story. And I think that you and I talked about this in class, I think basically I am so for the power of the media, but it needs to be more responsible in many ways. Not everything can be breaking news, or fighting over viewer support and hysteria. And things need to be explained more in context. And you can't do a lot of this without the media, but it has to be more responsible. But you do have to separate the social media from the cable and from the other.
Thank you. Yeah, in the corner.
I'm Maisha. We met just a little while ago.
Yeah.
My question is about rethinking rights and responsibilities and moving from humanitarian intervention to R2P. Even since 2005, when the World Summit document came out, there's been a very watered down version. And one of the obvious problems with R2P is that it's not binding, and in the foreseeable future, it's very unlikely that it's ever going to be binding. So what role should the United States be playing in its foreign policy as far as building consensus and building capacity for operationalizing R2P, especially considering what we've seen in the last few months and couple of years? Thank you.
I think the hardest, first of all, it's hard because of the sovereignty issue that I raised. But the other reason it's hard is who carries it out. The United Nations has no army. I personally would not favor a United Nations army, despite the fact that it was initially thought of in Article 43. So there needs to be some instrument to carry it out. And what is interesting is that even though it wasn't called R2P in Kosovo, it was NATO that carried it out. There was a question about the relationship of NATO to the Security Council, since there was not a specific mandate. So what you had in Libya all of a sudden was a Security Council mandate, and still who was going to carry it out. So NATO carried it out, but not all of NATO, which is I was asked to work on a new strategic concept for NATO, and somehow people hadn't focused on kind of a coalition of willing within NATO, but that is what happened. But what also happened that is novel is that the Arab League kind of plugged into and was going to do things with NATO. So that was an innovation within the international system. There are, however, issues, since many of the areas to do R2P are in either the Middle East or in Africa. Why would you have a bunch of white forces going into those areas? So it looks like an intervention that is by former colonialists in some time. And that was an issue in terms of who should carry out anything in Darfur, and yet the African Union in many ways is not fully capable of doing it. One of the things that I learned at the UN, and I made it a point to study the peacekeeping operations, I went to visit each one of them at the time, was that the Secretary General, in order to get a peacekeeping force, has to basically go around with a tin cup and start from scratch. And so we began to talk about something that at our time we call the African Crisis Response Force, that at least there would be countries, forces from countries that began to train together so that they would know what to do. But the bottom line is there still is not some group to carry things out. And it is and that's what some of the Syria question is about, whether I happen to believe that we're not going to be able to sit around much longer and watch this. But the question is which tool really works, and whether and what are the lessons out of various things. In Bosnia, of setting up safe areas which actually weren't safe and turned out to be Srebrenica, or whether there's some kind of a humanitarian corridor, who would really take care of it. One of the most difficult things that we were involved in is under what circumstances do Americans get involved in peacekeeping forces or in these responsibility to protect. And that also is an evolving concept, because mostly when we were in office, Americans did not want to fight under the command of a foreigner, basically forgetting what had happened during World War II. And the only way to have command of an operation is the larger the number of forces that you put in, the more likely you are to have command over it. And we don't want to put a lot of forces in. So these are the kinds of discussions that are going on. But I think that whoever in the Obama administration said leading from behind should be fired. But the bottom line is that we need to be a part of partnership within some other group, not let this all happen without any participation. That's my view. I speak for nobody but myself. But so that in Syria, for instance, according to what I read in the papers, there's some discussion about us providing communications equipment, logistics, et cetera. But I think we need to be a part of a larger tool, so to speak, of trying to fulfill R2P. The problem is who does it and what, and that's why the Arab League is an important part of it. One of the things that came out in the strategic concept was that we learned that NATO had more partners than it has members, so that they're now a series of partner organizations. The question was really, what is NATO's role at all after the end of the Soviet Union? And some of it is, in fact, to deal with these kinds of out-of-area problems in partnership with some non-NATO forces, i.e. not white forces, frankly, to put it in a non-PC language.
Great. We like that non-PC straightforwardness. Yeah. Right here in the flowered shirt.
Hello, my name is Christine Vidmar, and I'm an intern at Albright Stonebridge Group. I haven't been able to meet you yet, but I think it'll be shortly. So I wanted to kind of switch your hats over to ASG and ask, how have corporations' interests in the Middle East been affected by the Arab awakening? How have you dealt with your clients on these issues? And if you could speak a little bit about that.
First of all, let me kind of explain what we do. Is I did create a business after I left office in order to work with primarily American corporations in terms of helping them problem solve, and also to operate within an international system of how to be local partners, how to market access a variety of different aspects. And it also dovetails with another aspect. Secretary Clinton asked me to take on a project called Partners for a New Beginning, which is based on President Obama's Cairo speech of having a different relationship with Muslim-majority communities and countries. And this is an idea of, as it says, public-private partnerships. And the vertical pillars of it are to do economic empowerment, science and technology, education, and people exchanges. And the horizontal are how to get women and youth involved in all of that. And so obviously these are corporations, American corporations, that are a part of this in the Middle East. And so one of the things that one looks at is how to encourage. I mean, I came at my business as well as the way I think, and I learned this while I was Secretary of State. I know it terrifies people to think you actually learn something when you're already in the job. But what happened, just to tell you the story, is that I was invited out to Silicon Valley by John Chambers of Cisco to meet with the techies when I was Secretary of State. And they were saying, well, what good, here we are, American corporations, what help are you giving us as the government? What do you do for us? And I said, well, actually, we do a lot, because we are the ones that help on market access and trying to figure out regulations and various things. And then when I traveled, I would always give a speech to the American Chamber of Commerce somewhere, AmCham. And I spoke and I learned nothing. And I decided that what I wanted to do was to begin to meet with representatives of American companies abroad. And I learned a great deal from them, sometimes more than from our embassy, because they had different relationships in terms of how things worked. And I also thought that American companies had better labor and health policies than most local companies, and that they were partners that could help in terms of promoting American values in a different way. So the business is based on that concept. So we encourage our clients to be in a particular place, to be good local citizens where they are, and not to kind of abandon ship when there are problems. The issues that become complicated now are, and it has to do with what I talked about in class today about sanctions. What do you do when the United States government sanctions Iran, and there are companies there that have long-term contracts or something like that? How do you honor what your government wants and at the same time respond to what the needs of your owners are, whether your boards or your shareholders? And so I think that what is happening in the Middle East has affected how people, how companies feel about what their risk is in X country, what will happen, and at the same time, you don't want them all to pick up and leave. And so it's that balance of trying to figure out how to include them in this private-public partnership activities, and then in a broader sense of making sure, and it goes to the question about, is it all about oil? It isn't all about oil. It's about having Americans and American values and American business practices in a variety of other countries. So you don't want to just kind of say, this is a mess now, we're leaving the whole area. So that one.
Great. In the very back, and then we'll come to the front.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Brosnahan. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service and also in your class. And we look at Eastern European countries after the post-war and 20 years out. So many of them are still partially in transition in democracy or partially formed democracies. So how can the Arab Spring countries that have moved towards democracy avoid the pitfalls of the Eastern European countries, and what is the U.S.'s role in their transition? Thank you.
Well, I think that part of the thing that is evident from Central and Eastern Europe is that it's a lot harder than it looks. That people thought that these were, to go back to something that I said originally, European countries that had just been dominated by some horrible ideology, and if you lifted that away, that everything, they would all live happily ever after. And what is true is that first of all, many of them had kind of minimal democratic systems before. They had some set of democracies, but not they had emerged from World War II very much damaged. They had not been allowed to be part of the Marshall Plan, so that they did not get some of the infrastructure that they needed. And then the other part that I thought became evident is that the end of the Cold War and the empowerment of democracies in Central and Eastern Europe was wonderful for the elites. But the ordinary people who had gotten, whatever one might say about communism, it did in fact have some safety nets for poor people. And they were able to, there were retirement, it wasn't that their health services were so great, but they existed, or there were retirement plans. And when I talked about this survey that we did in '91, and we talked to people that were 50 and over, they were terrified. They had no idea what was going to happen to them, and they kind of felt isolated, and their country had disappeared. And so they're the ones that have had a harder time in adjusting. And then also, there have been those people that have taken advantage of the privatization, and there's a lot of corruption. So the lessons basically are that, first of all, and this is not a spectator sport, it's a marathon, that this is going to take a while, that it is very important to develop. And again, I was born in Czechoslovakia, so I can speak about them as I wish. But Václav Havel, one of the great leaders of the 20th century, actually didn't believe in political parties. Big mistake. And so he didn't create a political party of his own, and civil society part didn't really work. So I think they need to learn about the role of political parties and structures and patience, and not having it be elitist, and having education, and trying to get the people below involved. But there are the differences that I mentioned earlier, which did not exist in Central and Eastern Europe, that do in the countries that are involved in the Arab awakening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they don't have the strong incentive of membership in the European Union, of course, to help pull them forward.
Or NATO. I mean, that's part of the,
It's part of the uphill struggle. Yes, right here. Yeah. Actually, okay, sorry. And you'll have the last question. I've been promising this young man here. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Back.
My name is Chris Timko. I'm a freshman in the SFS, and my question's about the issue of intervention in Syria and right to protect. And it concerns the strategic interests of national actors or international actors, and then the international norms institutions of R2P. And how does the international community value R2P over geopolitical strategic issues and interests, especially in the case of Syria and balance of power considerations in the Middle East?
Well, they probably don't. I mean, part of what is going on, and this has to do with the whole national sovereignty issue, they don't want people intervening in their lives and telling them what to do. And interestingly enough, the reason that the Chinese and the Russians did not support the resolution is they don't want intervention in their lives either. And the big issue, and I find this so interesting, the United Nations was set up on the basis of the nation state and on the Westphalian system of national sovereignty. There are a few aspects of the Charter that do, in fact, allow for intervention in domestic affairs, but the bottom line is you have the right of self-defense, any number of ways that the nation state is protected. What is happening now more and more is that there are non-state actors that we don't quite know how the system works with at all. That is kind of the loose cannon in all of this, plus the role of information that tells us everything that's going on inside, very different than previously. And so there is this resistance, especially in places that are carrying out things that we might not agree with in terms of how you get involved. So the Chinese, again at the UN, the Chinese would never want to be a part of any discussion in the Security Council when I was around, unless it had something to do with intervention in interference in domestic affairs. Didn't matter what it was. That was something that really turned them on, and the Russians didn't want it either. And so that part, I think in many ways they are more interested in their national interest and don't want to have anything to do with R2P. And they will, in fact, see it as Western intervention in their lives, which is why it's so difficult. And on Syria, if we're going to talk, I think one of the things that we all need to think about, those of you that are in my class, you all got very tired of all this, but I say that every country makes foreign policy decisions based on 5 factors. Objectively, where is the objective facts about the country, location, resources, etc. Subjectively, how does a country feel at that particular moment? The third factor is how is the government organized, in our case, legislative, executive, different parties holding office. Then the fourth is what are the bureaucratic components, which in fact then get translated into what the budget looks like. And the fifth one are individuals. So if you look at whether we're going to intervene or not in Syria, you have to look at what the factors are. Objectively, where we are as a country, but what is the location of Syria vis-a-vis Libya? But the main thing that I would point to is how do we feel at this moment? And I have to tell you, what is interesting is I was just interviewed by Charlie Rose in front of 1,500 women in New York. And he was asking me, really pushing me to say that we should intervene in Syria. And pushing every button that I have, which is, you were the one that argued about Bosnia and Kosovo, why, blah, blah, and I kept saying, yes, we need to do something in partnership with others. There was not one applause line, which usually people would say, we do need to intervene. And what I'm saying is American public is fed up. And Iraq and Afghanistan is the reason. We have had it. And so, and it goes a little bit to the question of what are we a part of? And so we are watching dreadful things taking place in Syria, but that how do we feel component is something that's important. At the same time, because we're in the middle of a political season, you have John McCain saying we need to intervene, so you've got the executive, legislative. Where's the money coming from? We're about to do budget cuts, and you've got the individuals involved in it. And so I don't know where it's going, but I do think some of it is a desire to do, and with television showing these pictures, we want to do something, but whether we're actually going to move from here to there is a real question at the moment.
Right.
And it's a moral dilemma in many ways.
Yeah. I think you see that as well in the discussion about Iran, that the Iraq situation has made it very difficult to have a sort of coherent debate about that because people are so...
Which is why I say forever.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's bad news.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, in the back then, thank you.
Hi, my name is Noreen Sheikh. I'm a senior in the college. First of all, thank you for sharing your perspective today. And second, I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate or clarify a term used earlier, secular Muslim democracy, and kind of how this entanglement between religion and politics will shape the United States or even the Western perspective as we move forward.
I think, first of all, I think that most Americans do not understand Islam at all. I wrote a book, I call it my God book. It's the role of God and religion in foreign policy. And it's called The Mighty and the Almighty. And I really did something that I never thought I would do, is to look at the role of religion in foreign policy. And among the various things, when, believe it or not, when we started in office, most Americans didn't have a clue about Islam. And what happened was that I was the first one to put Muslim holidays on the official calendar, and to have iftar dinners and to do various things to try to understand what Islam was about. And we were about to publish a booklet on what various tenets of Islam when we left office, and then it was not done later. So there were real questions about, and I think that even the terminology, nobody knows. You know, somebody said, why would you talk about moderate Muslims? Moderate, there's no such thing, because if you say so, moderate Muslims believe in moderations passionately. You know, so it's hard to even figure out what the terminology is. Plus, I think that in many ways, Islam is not monolithic. So there are the various aspects to it. Where people talk about secular Muslim democracy is Turkey, where in fact the AKP party is composed primarily of Muslims, but it doesn't call itself a Muslim party. And I had a conversation at one stage with Prime Minister Erdogan, who said, we didn't do that despite the fact that there are Christian democratic parties in Europe, and people aren't offended by that. People don't like the terminology. And it is a question as to whether there is any kind of a separation of church and state, which is complicated in Islam because there isn't definitely. But the Turks don't like to be seen as a model for a secular Muslim democracy, but they do not insist on various aspects of the Muslim religion as far as it's not a theocratic state. There's a very interesting article, I guess it was yesterday, in the New York Times about the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, or maybe it was today, which describes the complication here, which is that even if he would like to see the Muslim Brotherhood in power, he is somebody who is much more doctrinaire about the fact that Islam is not just that Egypt can't just be a state, but it has to have Islam as a state religion. So I think it's a complicated concept. I did not invent it, but what happened was that Erdogan went to Egypt and he said, you need to have a secular Muslim democracy, meaning that it did not have to be the religion of the state. And theoretically, and this is true in Turkey, that in Egypt it would also allow for Christians and Copts and various, Copts are Christians, various other religions to be able to exist. But the thing that I've been saying, there are a lot of Americans who say, well, you can't have Islamic parties in the Middle East. Well, excuse me, most of the people are Muslims. They are likely to elect Muslims. And so it's very hard to say that you can't have Muslim parties. But I think we're trying to figure out what all the various aspects of it are. And in many ways hope that this is a situation that the Muslims themselves will solve in some ways, because you can't have Christians and Jews telling them what to do.
Let's see. I think we have time for one short last question. Great. Hannah?
Stand? Yeah. I feel like I'm blocking people. Hannah Birsch with the German and European Studies program. I'm a second year. And my question is about diplomacy in practice based on your experiences at the highest level. Recognizing that the European Union, and I appreciate your comments on multilateralism being an important approach to achieve great results for the U.S., even though we are an indispensable nation. With that in mind, the External Action Service recently created by the European Union, do you think that will alter the transatlantic relationship, or do you think it will be politics as usual, particularly with the Arab awakening or with other diplomatic initiatives? Thank you.
I think that the short answer is we don't know. I think part of the thing that's going on is that the whole concept of the European Union comes and goes. It is as I always, I have to say this is, whenever I meet with Europeans, I always say, I'm just like you. I was born in Europe. I just happen to have been raised in America, so let me tell you what I really think of you. And the bottom line is that the European Union itself keeps adjusting in some way, and there's no question that the economic crisis has affected how the European Union is functioning. What I find very interesting is that when push comes to shove, nationalism comes to the fore again. And what was interesting also, when I was doing the strategic concept for NATO, we met with the European Union, and at that stage, this was like 2.5, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, the European Union was riding high. And they basically thought, NATO isn't going anywhere. The main difference between the European Union and NATO is Turkey. There are other countries that are not members of NATO that are in the European Union and vice versa, but the main difference is really Turkey and how Turkey is viewed. But then all of a sudden, the European Union kind of lost luster, and there was just a sense back again in terms of national prerogatives. There always were the following issues out there, which were if there was a European foreign minister, that title, which is what Javier Solana was and Lady Ashton is now, what does that do to the national foreign ministers? They weren't about to disappear off the face of the earth, and they still wanted to be a part of the issue. The diplomatic service in these various countries also aren't going to disappear. And so it's not so much what the European diplomatic service is going to do, but how do they work with the national ones? We don't know the answer to that yet. I think in many ways, Americans, people don't often believe this, I can just tell you that it's true, is the United States wants to see a strong Europe. We are better off with a strong Europe. The United States needs a partner. We don't want to do everything by ourselves. And so it would be good to have a strong functioning Europe. What is really irritating is watching Europe examine its navel while we are trying to deal with a lot of the issues. So we're ready for Europe to get its act together. The only problem in life is that the most boring meetings that anybody ever attended are the US-EU meetings. I know President Clinton dreaded them, and he said, do we have to keep talking about bananas or whatever the issue was and not really essential issues? So, and then there is the whole issue of the European bureaucracy that people can't figure out. They go to Brussels and there are commissioners, and then there's various lower level bureaucrats, and I mean it's a massive bureaucracy. So in some cases people feel that there's been an additional layer now by the idea that there also is going to be a European foreign service, diplomatic service. So the answer is we don't know. I do think that if the European Union would get its act together, really, then Americans would be very pleased to deal with them. And the question is whether, how the system is working now, whether we just kind of shove the European Union in when we can't figure out, like on the Middle East lack of peace process, or Baroness Ashton and whatever she has to do now in terms of the Iran non-proliferation talks. And so, and then if I might say, there's a question about her own stature. You know, she was somebody that was not a foreign policy person. So how does that all work? So there are many different questions to it. I personally would like to see a strong Europe. I really would. But how the various issues that are now to do with not just the Eurozone, but also the various priorities, how that's going to work out, what the role of Germany is, how that operates, are the big questions out there. I think, just to conclude, is that I find very interesting in terms of I do teach, I love teaching, I do all these other things, but I also, in going back and looking over, I'm going through my papers at the moment in terms of things that I taught in the 80s and what I'm teaching now. Very different world. And one of the things that I've done is I am a groupie, and I created a group of former foreign ministers. We started out with a group that had done Kosovo together, and I invented something new, which sounds crazy, but the diplomatic conference call. I talked to the British, French, the Germans, and the Italians every single day during the war in Kosovo. And we agreed on a lot of different things, and we all missed each other, so I started this group. It has an official name. It's the Aspen Foreign Ministers Group. Its unofficial name is Madeleine and her exes.
Do you have a Facebook page?
No.
Oh.
But one of the things we're talking about now, and it's wonderful because we talk without our national positions, just based on the experience that we've had. And the sense is that the world is unbelievably fluid and that people do not have confidence in any institutions at the moment. It's true in our own country. I think maybe mayors actually still have some confidence of the people because they're the closest. But there certainly is no confidence in state governments or Congress or anything else. There is very little confidence in international institutions at the moment. What is the EU doing? Is the United Nations going up or down? You know, what are there new regional groupings that make any sense? And so the fluidity of the situation, plus the existence of non-state actors, plus the existence of so much information out there, has totally changed the world that I grew up dealing with or even teaching about in the 80s. Very different, which is where you all come in, because you don't have the kind of barnacles and various prejudices that many of us have, and it gives you an opportunity to re-look at these issues and try to figure out whether it's geostrategic issues or humanitarian issues, or what is it that motivates the international system, and what is the education needed by the generation of people that are going to do this. It is not purely studying political science, I assure you, as interesting as it is. But the stuff that I learned in college is useless. There was a lot of alphabet soup that doesn't exist. What I did learn in college was how to study and how to look at issues in a new way. And what is important is to have interdisciplinary aspect of all of this. You all need to work with people that are scientists, that understand health policy, that understand global warming, that understand religions, that understand anthropology, that understand languages, and a lot of different aspects that make this a much more interesting field than it used to be in many ways. So hats off to all of you.
Great.
Thanks.
I wanted to mention, actually, to sort of continue this conversation beyond this event, at Mortara we're actually running a year-long series on global governance, and tomorrow we have Jeff Dunoff, who's a very noted international law specialist, talking about fragmentation in international law, the question about these overlapping things such as sovereignty and right to protect and so on. And then we have Tom Pogue, who's going to be coming in and talking about global public health challenges. So please check out our website. Those events will be held at the Mortara building, and so we look forward to welcoming you there. But certainly this afternoon has been a great example of what you do so beautifully, which is go between the worlds of scholarship and teaching and your public service, and what we hope to be doing at Georgetown and at Mortara. So thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. And the reason that I wanted to be the Mortara professor was the following thing, that I found that the biggest disconnect is between the academy and practitioners. And I learned that wherever I am, whether I'm either in the academy or a practitioner, it's like this. And while, in fact, I think the academy has a great deal to offer in terms of knowledge and intellectual capital, it has to have a practical effect. And those who practice need to understand that there's a great deal to learn. And so what Mortara does, I think, is to bring, it's called the practice of diplomacy. And it really, I think, is a very important part of what you do. So thank you.
Thank you.